Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here with us tonight. I'm Sarah Chapman, and I'm the executive director of the nonprofit Media Burn Archive, which is based in Chicago. Media Burn collects, preserves, and distributes documentary and experimental media produced by artists, activists, and community groups. Our mission is to create positive social change by amplifying underheard voices, both in contemporary dialogue and the historical record. Before I get any further, I want to let you know the captions are available and you can access them via Zoom by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking the three dots that say more and turning on captions. That could help you during the discussion portion of the event and the intro, but during the screening, the film itself has burned in subtitles, so you can turn them back off at that point. Okay, so let's see. The discussion portion of the event is being recorded, and afterwards you will receive an email with a link. So if you have to drop out early, you'll be able to catch up. But please take this exciting chance to watch the film Incident, because it is currently in doing festivals, and so it's not going to be part of the recording. So you'll need to make sure you don't miss this part of the event tonight. So this event is part of an ongoing free series called Virtual Talks with Video Activists, which creates conversations surrounding media production. And if you enjoy this event, we hope you will join us for our next one in 1 month on December 7th. For a listening and discussion about Help This Garden Grow, a new podcast docuseries about Hazel Johnson, a visionary of the environmental justice movement, founder of People for Community Recovery, and a resident of the Altgeld Gardens community on the far south side of Chicago. That will be our last virtual event this year, and then we're planning a really great season next winter, primarily focused around the guerrilla television movement of the 1970s, leading up to a symposium at University of Chicago in April 19th to 21st. So that aside, tonight we are really excited to be presenting a screening and discussion of Incident, a new short film by acclaimed experimental filmmaker Bill Morrison. The film challenges the official police narratives surrounding the police killing of Harith Augustus in Chicago in 2018. We're joined by equally acclaimed journalist and activist Jamie Kalven, who's the founder of the Invisible Institute, and whose reporting was crucial to challenging the official police narrative surrounding this killing. Please be warned that the film contains footage of the actual shooting and its aftermath, and could be difficult to view. The film is 30 minutes long, and it's composed entirely of dash cam footage and officer cam footage and other surveillance footage. Also note that there is no audio for the first minute or so don't worry about that. It'll come in after a little bit. So the film's a half hour again, and after that we'll bring back Bill and Jamie for a discussion. While we're screening the videos, please stay muted or we will mute you. But you can write questions in the chat during the screening or anytime afterwards. And then during the Q&A, you can we'll answer those questions in the chat, but you can also raise your hand and you're able to ask your question out loud if you are interested in doing that. So with that, I think we are all set to go, and we will screen the film, and then we'll come back on for a discussion in a half hour.
Police shot. Shots fired at the police. Or police officer. Shoot.
715, we got a unit having an emergency, 715. Lance on 715, what we got and who are you? Yeah, 331, we're good EMS rolling for the offender and...
Sarge, that's me. You? Yeah.
Step fire, 31.
Pull the gun at me.
Aimers are 10.
You get him?
Yeah. Was there only one? Wait, only one?
Yeah,
Just you? Who else shot? Who else shot?
Hello, everyone. I just would like to welcome filmmaker Bill Morrison and journalist Jamie Kalven to speak with us about the film.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, really, the film began
Yeah, we had earlier done a project together with the British human rights group Forensic Architecture, and I'd urge people to check out their website. They do extraordinary sort of what they describe as counter investigations in human rights situations around the world. And in 2019, as part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, we collaborated on a project we called Six Durations of a Split Second, in which the intent was to interrogate the notion of the split second, which is very central to the law with respect to police involved shootings. There's this kind of narrow focus on the moment when an officer perceives a threat and decides to use lethal force. And under the law, there's actually a unanimous Supreme Court decision to this effect. Great deference is shown the officer's judgment and perceptions of risk within the split second. And so our sort of formal idea was to interrogate the split second by looking at the same interaction in 6 different timescales, from milliseconds to years. So we did that project, presented it. It had, significant impact at the time. And in the course of the project had just been, pulling video and other evidence from the city through FOIA requests, litigation, back channel negotiation. And then a couple of years later, through ongoing litigation, I was able to get all the body camera footage of all the officers present at the time of the incident and in the aftermath, completely unedited, which, it's worth remarking that that's pretty unprecedented, because usually the agency makes sort of editorial judgments under the law as to what's relevant. And so you would, again, get the moment of confrontation, but not the events that led up to it or the aftermath. And as Bill said, I wrote about it at the time, and that in turn, inspired Bill to do something that I could never have done, in prose, and just showing this really chaotic scene. Somebody's just been killed, and whatever the circumstances, this is an occasion for investigation. And in all that we see there, there's no investigation. There's this kind of the police ministering to one another, and obviously the principal officers are quite traumatized in the immediate aftermath. And a narrative develops, almost organically, that Harith Augustus drew a gun and, was shot necessarily in defending the officers and the public. In fact, and I think this is apparent in the film, but it's worth being explicit about. Once he's shot, he's on the ground, dead or dying. The first act of the police is to handcuff him, which is, within policy. The next is an officer comes and unbuttons his holster and takes his gun out. he never, the gun never left his holster. And what's in his hand is his FOID card, his firearms ownership card, which he was trying to show to the police at the moment they tackled him.
I was going to say the first thing that the police did was to say police shot, which was completely inaccurate, right? It's like, I think it's interesting also, there is the officer at the end who's unwittingly assigned what they call the paper, and that's necessarily not an officer who was on the scene. So it's supposed to be, some sort of objectivity involved, and that's Officer New, who goes around asking questions, and isn't even clear that an officer has shot this guy. So he quite correctly identifies it as first-degree murder, and calls the guy lying on the street a victim. Heretofore, he's been called the offender or the body or the guy in the ambulance, but people have taken great pains not to call him a victim, and to the eye that hasn't been apprised of what's gone down, it's and to anyone else coming upon the scene, it is first-degree murder.
I think the other thing that is so apparent in the film, and I don't think we've ever seen this dramatized to this degree, although in my reporting I've encountered it, multiple times, is when so-called white shirts, more senior supervisory officers come on the scene after an incident like this. They don't come to find out what happened. They're not coming to figure out what happened. They're coming, and I think this is really how they think about it in their own minds, to figure out how to justify what happened. So you may have noticed there were all sorts of citizen witnesses to what happened. These are witnesses to a homicide, and the response of the police is to shoo them away, to threaten them with arrest, to yell obscenities at them. These are people who are witnesses, who may have had unique perspectives on what happened. There's absolutely no interest in what they might have to say. So, the two officers principally involved, Megan Fleming, the female officer who grabs at Augustus, Dylan Halley, the officer who shoots, you see in the moments after, in this kind of, it's really rather poignant in a way, this almost hysterical call and response. He was going to shoot. He pulled a gun. You saved us, back and forth. I mean, that's a moment of existential crisis for them. I don't think they're, cooking up a narrative. They're trying to figure out how to sort of take the next breath. But that almost immediately, in less than 2 minutes, becomes the official narrative when a sergeant's on the scene, and you hear him saying to concerned onlookers among citizens, he pulled on it doesn't matter if he had a permit, he drew a gun on an officer. What do you expect? Yeah. So that hardens almost immediately into the narrative.
And then he reports to the commanders. Well, it was Halley who pulled a gun, and there you can see the disbelief in their face. They're like, he pulled a gun on who? Like the idea that a 37-year-old barber would pull a gun on 6 officers in the street is just preposterous, So
I would just add, we should see if there are questions, but I would just add that, in Chicago, the Laquan McDonald case has been sort of the defining atrocity in this last decade, and there's been endless discussion of it. I've been involved because I reported on it initially and brought it to public attention. I actually think this case has more to teach us about the really systemic problems in policing than the McDonald case, and truly hope that Bill's film remains a part and increasingly becomes part of a public record and an ongoing conversation, because this is this combination of incompetence, really lack of knowledge of the applicable rules, discomfort of white officers in a black neighborhood where they can't recognize that somebody like Harith Augustus, a local tradesman walking down the street, is not a menace to society. All of these things sort of combine to produce, utterly racist and tragic outcomes, without an obvious proactive racist presence like Derek Chauvin was in the George Floyd case. So there's a lot to learn from this, and I think we're really just beginning that process.
Yeah, I mean, and we spoke to an officer the other day when we were in Chicago, and they made the point, and this is always the case, that there's everyone tells the officer that you did nothing wrong, and I love, she said, what job do any of us have when our superiors are constantly telling us you did nothing wrong? So anyway, we can open it up to questions.
It looks like Ellen Morrison is raising her hand, and then a question is also coming in the chat after that.
Hi, guys. I was just wondering, I guess I can put my hand down. Maybe, Bill, you just answered as much as you've heard about it, but I was wondering if, since I know the film was shown in Chicago, has there been any word that the Chicago police have any awareness of the film? Any response? Or, I mean, it seems it'll probably take a while before it gets back to them, I imagine.
I'm sure they were aware of Six Durations, right, Jamie?
Six Durations, we were in active dialogue with the city and the police, and actually the COPA investigation that was done years after the incident, I think, was as much in dialogue with our project as anything else. I mean, they were sort of challenged to I think, do a better investigation than they otherwise would. I don't think I'm violating any confidentiality to say that as soon, the day that the architecture biennial opened, there was publicity about our project, in the papers, in part because we were contending with the city over documents and such. And one of the first phone calls I got was from the office of the superintendent of police, who a week later came down to the site where we were displaying the videos, and spent a couple of hours with me, talking, wide-ranging conversation in the course of the early weeks of the project. And we have it in a kind of makeshift studio on the south side. The inspector general brought his staff down. Tony Preckwinkle, the president of the Cook County Board, came with senior staff. Kim Fox, the state's attorney, as well as community residents, activists, and a smattering of people in law enforcement over time. So in that phase of the project, there was a lot of back and forth and kind of visibility with the city and the police department. I think that's yet to happen with this film. But as Bill was saying, we had a conversation with an officer the other day, and we're kind of actively talking about strategies to bring this kind of content into the police academy. And in police academies all across the country, and certainly in this one, part of the training is they show again and again, videos, many of them are on YouTube, of officers, being very polite and civil in their interactions with citizens and getting blown away, in a traffic stop or somewhere. So the overwhelming lesson is that the danger is you won't be aggressive enough, you won't be preemptive enough, you won't shoot first. And this video represents a whole other set of dangers that it's really important that officers be mindful of.
The question in the chat from David Sinaiko, it says, Bill, what kind of editorial choices did you make in the framing or the sound mix? Did you work with Jamie to make them?
I pretty much worked on my own with the edit, though what Jamie wrote was definitely instructive in how to frame it. For instance, he mentioned in his article that Harith lay prone for however many minutes it was. And so that gave me the idea of to have a quadrant that constantly showed Harith, and then that led to the concept of the quad screens, and therefore that everything could be synced and you could have these different and opposing views. So, I was left to my own devices on the edit itself. And with the audio, the only audio that was provided was by the body-worn camera. The closed circuit TV, the POD, which is the police observation device, the aerial, the dashboard cams, any of those other surveillance cameras are mute. And there is a 30-second buffer of audio that happens when these cameras are manually operated. And that's, of course, a flaw in the system. And if you're asking an officer to turn on their camera just as something's happening, I liken it to like if you've been sitting there fishing all day and all of a sudden you get a big fish on and now you have to remember to turn your camera on. It should have already been on and they shouldn't have to think about it. But of course, that's going to be a lot to ask anybody to have to be monitored all day long by a video. At any rate, at that point, you have the 30 seconds of audio before they push the button, which is available. And I would imagine that could be technically figured out how that could be longer. So the first moment of audio we got is police shot. So my film follows the roughly, I guess it's about 18 minutes of audio from that moment to the point where the commanding officer says, okay, well, all officers on the scene turn their cameras off. And that concludes what we can see of that sort of sham investigation. And now they can talk amongst themselves. And I thought that was an important defining point for the end of this incident. Of course, and I make reference, there goes on to be a police riot later that evening. But this seemed like a cleaner stopping point. As to the question of sound design, it's mostly stereo. You do get some crowd stuff in the back, and we did a 5-1 mix so that if you were to hear this in the theater, the people who are on the south side of 71st Street appear in are heard in the rear speakers.
I would just add in terms of sound that one of the things that Bill was able to do was to lift up the sort of community voices that function like a kind of a Greek chorus throughout, asserting a reality that apparently the police are, oblivious to.
That also gets back to sort of the genesis of the project. Long before this happened, Jamie and I would run into each other on the street and we would talk about the idea of a police story that could be told with multiple cameras, and each camera would be a different type of media. One would be a phone, one would be a surveillance camera, body-worn camera, whatever it was, and would also tell a different point of view. So it was quite amazing to me when this happened, and I was like, oh my God, this is the Rashomon project, as we've been calling it, that we've been talking about for years here in our laps. And the crowd is not infallible either. That you hear two different people say that he didn't have a gun. Of course, he did have a gun. You hear the inaccuracies of the police account. So you're hearing different points of views that are showed their sympathies or reveal their sympathies. And I think the crowd says a lot of amazing things when the guy says, you whisked them away so they could get their fucking stories together. He's absolutely right. That for all intents and purposes, they've left the scene of the crime, and now they're all talking amongst themselves and they're hardening this narrative. Like, as Jamie said, might have started out as this sort of desperate wheezing or hyperventilation, but now it's becoming, as they repeat it to each other, it's becoming what happened. And indeed, this is the official narrative.
And now there's another question. Bill, this film is incredibly powerful, but I can't imagine watching and rewatching this footage as many times as you must have done in order to make it into a film. What was it like to spend that much time with these images? And that's probably certainly the same for both of you, probably.
Yeah, I think Jamie spent a lot of this time with these images as well. It really these voices get into your head. Especially Megan Fleming really got into my ear like earworm, and it was tough. I will say that it's projects like these where I just think they're important and I can see how they can be realized, that I find the most exciting. And that's when I get into sort of a state where I don't need a lot of sleep. I just want to get up and work on it further. And so I really plunged pretty deep into this as a project over a relatively short amount of time. What also was sort of disorienting about it is that I was editing it here, and I'm in my studio in the East Village in New York. And so I felt like I'd spent a lot of time in that half hour between 5:30 and 6 p.m. on July 14th, 2018 on East 71st Street, but I'd never actually been there. So I returned to Chicago, and my mom and my sister live in Hyde Park. And I went back about a year ago, and I went directly to that grocery store and sandwich shop and kind of walked up and down that sidewalk, and got a feel for where those trees were, and where the fence was, and lived it for a moment.
Yeah, I would just add that I've spent a lot of time in this project and others, immersed in this kind of evidence, and it is, it wears on you. But there's also, I'm not sure if fascination is the right word. There's almost a privileged sense of being able to inch by inch get closer to a reality that's otherwise elusive, and to try to describe it with the utmost precision. So from a journalistic point of view, as well as a filmmaking point of view, there is a kind of obsessive engagement with the material that carries you through.
We have a really long question. I'll try to read it, and this will probably be our last one. In an essay called Violence in the Media, Michael Haneke says, the topic of violence in the media is typically brought up with the goal of placing a guilty party under arrest. Depending on the conviction of the debaters, either the media are that objective, quote, mirror of society, reflecting nothing but reality itself, or the permanent presence of violence in the media is what really bears responsibility for the increasing violence in our daily interactions with each other. On the hunt for a scapegoat, this form of discourse quickly turns into a fundamental chicken or egg question. The inconclusiveness of this inquiry is productive for both discursive positions. Both are right. Under that light, form in the means of representation comes as a fundamental to the topic. I don't know if the incident appeared on the news, but if it did, probably showed a different, quote, narrative compared to what really happened. Editing sounds and images and benefit of it, parentheses, conditioning the audience. In the process of editing the film, you probably had hours of footage, and yet the film is 30 minutes and is very precise. And it feels very liberating in the sense of allowing the audience to not get conditioned by the images. How did you approach the editing of something like this? Perspective is crucial to it. So what camera do you, quote, prioritize more than the others, knowing that all of them show the truth of what happened?
Well, first of all, Jamie, do you want to talk about how that one camera view was released first by the police?
Yeah, so just briefly, I mean, I'm assuming we're mostly Chicagoans here. That it was 13 months from the, I initially made known that there was dash cam video in the Laquan McDonald case. And it was fully 13 months after the incident when video was finally released under a court order. In this case, some years later, the police department, on its own initiative, released video, edited video to support a particular narrative in less than 24 hours after the incident. As Bill made reference, later that night, there was disorder and something that I think does deserve to be called a kind of mini police riot, where police officers just lost all restraint and, waded into the crowd of residents who had remained on site and beat people with batons. But, so I think there was a real concern about continuing agitation about the shooting, continuing organizing, continuing community concern being expressed. And the video was released, with the clear intent of establishing that Harith Augustus had a gun and presenting ambiguous evidence in such a way, kind of freeze frame to suggest that he was reaching for his gun. And it really worked. The news coverage died out almost completely. And there were no further demonstrations. So, and the case had largely disappeared from view until we did the 6 Durations project.
Yeah, and so that shot being the last one we see that I slowed down, and it's the only shot I slowed down. And then I edited the dashboard cam where you see Hallie actually unloading underneath it, and you see, to my mind, Hallie's already drawn his gun by the time Harith touches the holster. But at any rate, they just showed a slowed down, and then, as Jamie said, freeze frame shot of Harith and with his shirt up, and it's exposed that indeed he has a gun, and that was enough to dissipate any public discourse about it. We did have a lot of footage. There was, again, I was led by the construct of trying to show the corpse unattended, objectified. That the police mission was to clean up the street as quickly as possible to make this body go away. It was a hostile environment. We hear the sergeant say to the commander, let's get rid of this body. That asking the ambulance to transport a dead body, and there's a conversation about that. So that was the way I framed it. Of course, there was principal officers who were involved all the way, well, not all the way through, but they overlapped each other. Hallie being the first to have his camera on, Fleming later, and she keeps hers on. She turns hers off when she gets out of the car, but Hallie still doesn't understand, and he still has his on. And it's not until Lieutenant Ward, who's driving them around, tells him, turn your camera off. And now we're back to the eye in the sky, the POD camera, and then a new set of characters get introduced. His co-worker, the sergeant that we're familiar with before, and then the Officer Amers, who we originally saw handcuffing Augustus, and now he comes in rubbing his hands with sanitizer, and then we're introduced to Officer New, who's assigned the paper report. So it's sort of in these 2 chapters, before and after Hallie's camera is turned on and off. And as Jamie said, I started to understand the crowd's role in this as a counter narrative, as sort of a Greek chorus. There's incredibly funny or gallows humor things being said. All of them are right. I thought it was an interesting unintended vehicle for the police. The body-worn camera is supposed to represent the police point of view. It's positioned over their heart. It sort of intrinsically is supposed to give empathy to the dire situation the officer has put himself in or herself in. And in this case, it's also picking up this narrative of the righteous crowd that's observing it from a different standpoint. So I thought we could prioritize those voices within the narrative.
We have 2 more questions if you're able to stick around to answer them. I think just following on that thread of cameras, someone's asking about whether you looked for other cameras, like security cameras from businesses. And also if you could just clarify how that POD overhead camera works. And I guess I had a question about that as well, like who's zooming in?
Yeah. So the POD, I guess, is always on. And it is, there's like a control station somewhere remotely that when something happens, then it somebody's on it and starts zooming and figuring out where things are. So that's manual. I did do 1 zoom at the very beginning before they zoomed in, as the seagull flies by. I digitally zoom past an obstructing lamppost there, and so there's a first slow zoom that's mine as the case is unraveling before anybody would know to zoom, and then they zoom once there's an actual corpse on the or body on the ground. What was the other part of that question?
If I can add on the the other available video. So there's a long history there. There is, and some of it's in the film initially. There's some, third-party surveillance video from the shops on 71st Street. But we had, COPA, the oversight agency, after the in the sort of post-Laquan McDonald era, is obligated to release all relevant video in police shootings in no more than 60 days. And so COPA, dutifully released a lot of video, represented to the courts that it had released everything. We had FOIA'd for the police records of the incident, the police reports, a couple hundred pages, and we found references to two third-party videos that weren't in the release and a dash cam video. And so started hammering on COPA, in print and in negotiations. And actually, it turned out that the dash cam video, which is critical because that's the portion that shows Officer Halley stepping aggressively into the street and shooting, that was not available in the initial release. And they had lost it. They had effectively lost it. That an investigator had failed to download it from the main sort of catchment area for all the footage, and it gives you pause to think about just the kind of management and stewardship of this sort of evidence. Similarly, they had mislabeled, it turned out, the two CCTV videos that they later found, but only because of our sort of clamoring about it did they track this video down. And particularly with the dash cam video, it's critical to an understanding of the encounter. So there are some serious questions about just the handling of this kind of evidence that COPA has acknowledged, and there were changes in procedure as a result of this case and those sort of failures with respect to evidence. But I think we've got everything now, but it took years.
Okay, and the last question was about the release plans for the film, and if there's specific audiences being targeted or specific impact goals, and just generally what the future is for the film.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. With a short film, there's limited outlets to get it out to a wider audience, right? But we're going through the festival circuit now. We've been in as far as that goes, we've been in a bunch of festivals. There is this sort of dance you do, because should anyone want to pick it up, they don't want to see that it's been shown on the internet a lot, right? They want to have whatever the broadcast premiere or whatever it turns out to be. So I guess we have to wait that out to see if it gains enough momentum that it gets picked up by someone. But ultimately, I do want it to be available as widely as possible, with the caveat that people should know that they're watching something pretty intense and could be very upsetting, so that there should be some sort of gate or acknowledgement that you're going to see violent and potentially upsetting material. I wouldn't want it just to be available on YouTube and you click on it and you can see this. I think there needs to be at least some sort of level of protection.
I would just add, from a journalistic or human rights perspective, it's a really important document in terms of the larger public debate about state violence and police violence. I don't think there's ever been as granular and compelling a representation of the reality that in so many of these instances, so many of the high visibility cases of the last decade, it's actually it's not criminal conduct, it's police conduct that produces the so-called split second in which the police respond with lethal force. It's produced by the police. And think about various incidents. Eric Gardner, a man selling loose cigarettes on the streets of New York. George Floyd, somebody allegedly passing off a counterfeit $20 bill. You can go on and on. Tamir Rice, a little boy playing with a toy gun in a playground. I mean, there are countless, examples of this now. And to be able to, in a single narrative, show the events leading up to that moment, and then the process by which, virtually from the moment the body hits the ground, the narrative is being constructed. The official narrative is being constructed. These are just sort of critically important perspectives that I think could enrich the larger public discourse about these patterns of avoidable state violence against Black Americans.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to have Bill Morrison and Jamie Kalven with us tonight, sharing this film and having such a stimulating discussion. And yeah, thank you for everyone who joined us. And we'd love to see you again sometime in the future. So
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
good night.
Good night.
Good night.